After losing the love of his life and then his own son, due to his inability to put down his own reanimated wife, Morgan Jones ended up losing his mind for some time. And as a result, the man adopted the murderous mindset of Clear, where this madman aimed to cleanse the world of the living and the dead. Hell, it got so bad that Rick found this guy all stocked up like a pro Zomboid player. Like seriously, look at this shit, this guy is ready for Horde Night. That being said, he was eventually captured by a based, heavy-set bald guy named Eastman. This dude pretty much beat Morgan's ass into submission and then he rehabilitated him, gifting him with a new ideology that gave him a new purpose for living. Said ideology in question was the belief that all life is precious. And it's precisely that belief, that ethical code, that I want to tackle in this video. Now, in order to ascertain whether all life is truly precious, I think it would be prudent to first clarify what Morgan means by such a proclamation. Life is an incredibly complex concept that even scientists to this day still debate. But for the purpose of this video, I believe we can just settle with the colloquial understanding of the concept, being that life covers sentient entities like humans and animals, along with non-sentient entities like microbial life and plants. Now, when Morgan states that all life is precious, he seems to only apply that standard to entities which are sentient and conscious, as he is very likely a vegetarian just like his mentor Eastman. Morgan views such life to be so valuable that he views the termination of said life to always be wrong. And while I agree with the notion that humans and animals have inherent moral value, at least in a normative sense, I don't believe that all human life and all animal life is so sacred that we cannot ever justify the termination of said life. But before we can get to the part where I talk about justifiable homicide, I want to talk about what grants human life moral worth, at least insofar as I see it. Now, if we ignore my meta-ethical beliefs, as a eudaimonistic utilitarian, I believe that human life has moral value precisely because it is sentient and conscious. It is the ability to actively feel pain and pleasure that is, in my view, the bare minimum requirements for moral worth considerations. And human beings meet those bare minimum requirements, while also surpassing them with the qualities of self-awareness, moral instincts, moral agency, and high levels of intelligence. These higher qualities are also why human beings are generally viewed to be more valuable than other living beings. And yet the bare minimum qualities are also why we value animals and their experience of life more so than plants or microbial life. As a matter of fact, it is the ability of many animals to possess these bare minimum requirements for moral worth that ultimately justifies ethical vegetarianism and ethical veganism's core claim, being that while animals may not be our complete equals, their interests must be weighed equally or at least must be considered because they too can actively suffer. Asserting that human life is precious or sacred merely for being human is a claim that needs to be justified somehow, because such a statement is just circular reasoning, where the conclusion of said claim is being used as the premise of the same claim or argument. Before we move on, let's go ahead and conduct a quick thought experiment. Imagine a human being born with only the medulla oblongata and no other neurological structures. The medulla oblongata governs biological activities like breathing and one's heart. It governs these organs in a manner that makes the operation of said body parts unconscious or autonomous. It's why you don't have to think in order for your heart to function, and it's also why you're able to breathe while you're unconscious. Now imagine this human being being born and then living into adulthood with no advances in cognitive development. It would look just like any other normal person. Yet such a being would not be sentient, would not be conscious, would not be self-aware, and would possess no other higher qualities often associated with actual people. And yeah, sure, pain receptors would definitely activate in response to external stimuli, but there wouldn't be anyone present to actively experience those receptors firing off. You wouldn't be able to have a relationship with such a being as well. It would be totally apathetic to its own existence because it wouldn't even know that it exists in the first place. Continuing to exist would grant it zero benefits that it can actively experience, just as termination would not deprive it or harm it in any way that it could actively experience. Such an entity wouldn't be classified as a person because it's pretty much impossible to be a person without a personality. A dog or a pig or even a fucking gnat would have more moral value as far as I'm concerned. It may look like us, but it is not akin to us. So are we really going to sit here and say that such an entity's life is precious? Of course not. This is why people mourn when a loved one enters a permanent, irreversible coma. It's because they know the person they love is actually gone despite them still being alive on a technicality. And this is nothing like a temporary coma or even the state of being asleep, where we can expect the person in question to eventually wake up, and where we can also reasonably expect them to want to resume their life once they do wake up. Everything that makes us who we are ultimately comes from the mind. And if that shit's gone, then so are you and everything that grants you moral value. With all of that being said, Morgan's ethical code also abstains from unnecessary violence, often aiming to avoid conflict entirely. But when a conflict must be had, Morgan's ideology demands that he incapacitates his opponent in a less than lethal manner. Keeping that in mind, I'd like all of you to ponder the following. What happens when a life must be terminated in order to save the life or lives of other people? How do Morgan's beliefs handle a classic trolley problem, for example? Under Morgan's belief, the proper response to a classic trolley problem is to not get involved, because intervening will result in Morgan killing someone. But if he doesn't intervene to sacrifice one for the many, he is hence condemning the many to die. If life is as precious as Morgan claims it to be, then he also has an obligation to act in order to save it. But his absolutist ethical code sort of collapses when put under such a stressful moral dilemma. He is obligated to intervene, but cannot intervene in a manner that ends another life. His beliefs pretty much place him in a classic catch-22 when it comes to the trolley problem. What if the only way to save a victim from an aggressor is to kill the aggressor? What if that aggressor won't stop hurting or killing others unless they themselves are terminated? What happens when the only way to survive a situation requires that we terminate the life of an animal? Something that could potentially violate Morgan's vegetarianism. What if Morgan is being attacked, and the only way to save himself is to kill his attacker? I mean, yeah, the attacker's life is precious, but Morgan's life is also precious. What happens when someone is under excruciating pain with no end in sight? What happens when someone is destined to suffer perpetually until they die an agonizing death? Is the answer not to euthanize that individual? If someone has no hope of attaining a surplus or even neutrality in well-being, pleasure, and/or happiness, then euthanization is the right choice. To force someone to live through such a ghastly fate is deeply unethical in my view, and I dare say you all ought to feel the same damn way. Yet under Morgan's code of ethics, the proper act is to allow a person to experience a fate worse than death because the act of being alive is more important than the quality of the life in question. And not only would Morgan be obligated to allow this person to suffer, but he would also be obligated to intervene when said person opts to end their own misery, thus forcing them to live when they no longer have any rational reason to exist. Now here's an even more controversial case of justifiable homicide. And I hope you're ready because this is definitely going to trespass into political territory, so please don't hate me for it. The case in question is the termination of a fetus's life, especially a fetus that is prior to the age of 24 to 27 weeks, as after that time frame, a fetus is likely to have the necessary neurological structures for rudimentary sentience and consciousness. This is something that is widely documented as well. A fetus cannot be sentient or conscious prior to this time frame. And spoiler alert, having a heartbeat doesn't fucking matter. And as previously mentioned, having functional pain receptors means jack shit when no one is going to experience those receptors going off. Simply put, a fetus does not meet the bare minimum requirements for moral worth considerations prior to viability or the onset of rudimentary sentience and consciousness. Now, I know that some might argue that the fetus will eventually be a person, which is certainly true, assuming that the pregnancy in question doesn't end via miscarriage, which I believe is 1 in 4. But to argue that our rights trickle down to our earliest stages of development is a dubious argument at best. And a great way to highlight the inherent flaw with this argument is merely to apply to minors. Check this out. A child will eventually be an adult. Does that then mean we should grant the child the right to have intercourse with adults? You see, potentiality does matter, but actuality matters a hell of a lot more. A fetus prior to attaining sentience and consciousness does not have any moral value outside of the subjective value placed onto it by its mother.
But Captain Gold, you pretty much said that we shouldn't kill someone who is in a temporary coma or who's asleep because they'll eventually wake up. Doesn't that mean we should never kill the fetus because it too will eventually wake up?
No. In those examples, the person in question is already a person with a past, with an identity, with relationships, and a personality and ambitions. Prior to viability or the onset of rudimentary sentience and consciousness, a fetus was never a fucking person to begin with. It is completely and totally indifferent to its own existence. It literally has no preferences. Hence, it would be silly to assume that it would like to wake up someday. In the same light, it would also stand to say that it's fairly ridiculous to assert that the fetus is innocent for the same aforementioned reasons, because the concepts of innocence and corruption or guilt require some level of moral agency, or at minimum, moral instincts, in order for them to exist. And a fetus prior to the aforementioned time frame doesn't possess the necessary cognitive structures for such agency to exist. This is why we don't say that rocks are innocent or that bacteria is guilty of hurting us. To even use such language is to rely on and appeal to emotion that's not based on our scientific understanding of human anatomy. Now, I could keep going on for another hour or so on the complexities of the ethics of reproductive rights, as this is a topic that I've literally specialized in for many years, but we can stop here for now, as I know some of you are violently clacking away on those keyboards in the vain attempt to explain to me why I'm wrong about this, foolishly thinking you'll somehow surprise me with an argument that I've never seen before, knowing damn well that you've likely never even read at least one serious book on the topic. Yes, I read the comments and I can tell when some of you actually have merit. And no, I don't care if that offends you in any way. Setting aside my overtly rude and egotistical confidence on that very specific issue, if y'all would like for me to elaborate further on this topic, let me know in the comments section. I may one day start a secondary channel where I go further in depth on more serious topics. With that said, yes, we can convincingly argue, as do most bioethicists, that fetuses have no inherent moral value prior to viability or the onset of sentience and consciousness. This in turn justifies abortion, which is definitely the termination of a human life. And to be frank, I'm not sure how Morgan's ethical code would apply to abortion. It honestly would depend on how Morgan interprets his own ideology, but considering his commitment to nonviolence and his general respect for life, I'd wager that he'd likely be pro-life, which would then mean that he'd be wrong on this issue as well. But this is just speculation, because you could hold Morgan's worldview and still be pro-choice. Regardless of that fact, if you think abortion isn't an appropriate topic for a Walking Dead video, you're more than welcome to fuck off. I mean, the topic is literally tackled in Season 2 of the show. All things being considered, I believe that Morgan is ultimately wrong precisely because his ideology is too rigid. It simply cannot survive being stress tested to its limits. And we see this demonstrated in the show quite often. Human life, and even animal life, does have value, in a normative sense at least. But that does not then mean we cannot justify the termination of said life under the proper circumstances. At best, Morgan's ideology can allow us to arrive to the most ethical position given the right conditions. But at its worst, Morgan's code can lead to avoidable and unnecessary suffering and death. Because sometimes in order to save lives, one must either take lives or allow them to be lost. Given that conclusion, I find Morgan's justification for this ideology to be generally interesting from a narrative perspective. He eventually admits that he needs this philosophy, this purpose, because without it, he loses himself. So in a sense, Morgan practices this worldview because of the utility it grants him personally, more so than the actual validity of the philosophy. And in a way, his insistence on adhering to this code often reminds me of Batman's religious adherence to his no-kill rule. Both men attempt to justify their beliefs rationally, but deep down, both men believe what they believe because of the utility of their philosophical positions, more so than the validity or truth of said propositions. Anyways, if you like this sort of content, please like, share, and fucking subscribe. And smash that notification icon until you see red, because here's not here. Also remember that you may opine anytime if you feel so inclined down in the comment section. I'm Captain Gold and hope to see you in my next Gold Standard video.